1921. 300 Ku Klux Klan riders gathered in one place for a single purpose: to erase a fat black ranch owner named Ezekiel Booker from the map and leave his land as a warning. They came with rope already knotted, with warrants already promised, with church alibis prepared before the first torch was lit. Booker owned property they believed he hadn't earned, lived alone where no black man was supposed to survive, and carried a body they mistook for weakness. By sunrise, every rider was gone. Horses returned without men. Badges were found in the mud. Masks floated in swamp water. The county called it impossible, then called it treason, then stopped calling it anything at all. What happened on that ranch was never reconstructed, only buried. And the men who rode that night learned too late that certainty is not protection. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun rose slow over the delta, dragging light across land that had never forgiven anyone for working it. Ezekiel Booker stood in his yard, boots planted in mud that sucked at leather, and watched the morning turn from gray to gold. He was a big man, not tall, but wide, carrying weight that made people look away or stare too long, depending on what they needed to believe about him. His hands were enormous, thick fingers that moved with surprising care as he lifted the first bucket of feed. The cattle knew his footsteps. They gathered at the fence line, lowing soft, pressing against wood that held because Zeke had reinforced every post himself. He poured grain into troughs worn smooth by years of use, then stood back while they ate. No wasted motion, no hurry. To anyone watching from the road, he would look exactly as expected: slow, simple, harmless. A fat man doing fat man's work, content with his small piece of nothing. Zeke knew better. He moved through the morning routine with deliberate precision. Check the water pumps, inspect the fence lines, walk the property edges where his land met swamp. Every step mapped in his mind, every detail noted and remembered. The cattle needed tending, yes, but that was only part of the work. The real work was in the land itself. He walked the western pasture first, where the ground sloped unevenly toward standing water. A stranger would see poor drainage, bad planning. Zeke saw channels cut at specific angles, designed to guide movement in predictable directions. He knelt beside one depression, testing the mud with his fingers, still soft. Good. A man running in the dark would step here and sink to his knee. Not deep enough to trap, but deep enough to slow, deep enough to make noise. The fence posts here looked normal. They were not. Half had been weakened deliberately, sawed partway through and disguised with mud and rot. Pull on one wrong and the whole section would collapse inward, tangling anyone trying to breach it. Zeke checked each mark he'd made, small notches invisible unless you knew where to look. By midday, the heat pressed down like a hand. Zeke moved to the barn, checking supplies he'd gathered over months. Rope in specific lengths, tools positioned within reach, kerosene in unmarked containers. Everything exactly where it needed to be, when it needed to be there. He was carrying water back from the pump when he saw her. Lillian Mayhew stood at the property line, one hand shading her eyes, the other gripping her skirt against the wind. She was young, maybe 20, with the kind of face that expected softness from the world, and usually got it. Her dress was clean. Too clean for standing in delta dust. Zeke stopped walking. He did not approach. He simply stood there, bucket in hand, and waited. She took a step forward, then hesitated. Her mouth opened, closed. She looked back toward the road, then at him again, and something in her expression shifted. Fear, maybe, or guilt, wearing fear's shape. She started, but the word died in the heat. Zeke said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence made white people uncomfortable in useful ways. They would fill it with truth or lies, and either one told you what you needed to know. Lillian took another step back. "I just wanted to—" She stopped again. Her fingers twisted in her skirt. "They said you were— I needed to see if—" "Ma'am," Zeke said, his voice low and even. Just that one word. Polite. Expected. She flinched like he'd shouted. "I made a mistake," she said suddenly, the words rushing out. "I didn't mean for— I thought maybe if I came here and explained—" Zeke waited. But whatever explanation she'd convinced herself to deliver never came. She stood there, mouth working, eyes filling with something that might have been tears, or might have been recognition that tears wouldn't work here. Then she turned and walked quickly back toward the road, her shoes kicking up small clouds of dust. Zeke watched until she disappeared. Then he carried the water to the trough and poured it slow, listening to the cattle drink. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the delta in shades of copper and rust. Zeke sat on his porch, a chair reinforced to hold his weight creaking beneath him. In his lap were maps he'd drawn himself, pages worn soft from handling, property lines, access roads, swamp channels, positions marked in pencil that could be erased if anyone came looking. He studied them without urgency, tracing routes with one thick finger, confirming what he already knew. In the distance, faint but distinct, came the sound of horses, multiple riders moving together, still miles out but coming closer. The sound carried across flat land, the way sounds do when there's nothing to stop them. Zeke folded the maps carefully and set them aside. He stood, joints protesting slightly, and walked to the porch railing. The last light caught the swamp water, turning it bronze. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called out and went silent. He counted the hoofbeats, estimated distance, calculated time. Then he went inside to prepare his supper, moving through his kitchen with the same unhurried care he'd shown all day. The riders would come when they came. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for a long time. He ate alone, chewing slowly, tasting nothing. Outside, the sound of horses grew steadily louder. The town of Cypress Bend had one main street, and Lillian Mayhew walked down it with her dress torn at the shoulder. She had done that herself, standing behind the general store, fingers shaking as she pulled at the fabric until it gave. The sound of it ripping made her stomach turn, but she kept pulling anyway. When she walked into the sheriff's office 20 minutes later, her hair was disheveled, her face streaked with carefully applied tears, and her story was ready. Sheriff Calvin Rourke looked up from his desk, took one look at her, and stood slowly. "Miss Mayhew," he said, his voice flat. "What happened?" Lillian let herself tremble. It wasn't hard. She was already shaking, though not for the reasons she'd let him believe. "That man," she whispered. "That Booker man. He approached me at his property line, said things, put his hands—" She stopped, covering her face. Rourke waited, his expression unchanging. He'd seen this performance before, in various forms, from various women. The details always differed. The outcome never did. "He touched you?" Rourke asked. He tried to. The lie came easier the second time. "I ran. I barely got away." Rourke walked around his desk, boots heavy on wooden floorboards. He was a lean man, all angles and efficiency, with eyes that assessed rather than sympathized. "You went to his property alone?" "I was walking. I didn't realize how close I'd gotten until—" "What time?" "Just past noon." Rourke nodded slowly, already calculating. "You came straight here?" Lillian hesitated. This was the weak point, and she knew it. Hours had passed. She'd walked home first, sat in her room, convinced herself not to speak, then convinced herself again that she had to. But admitting that delay would raise questions she couldn't answer. "I was frightened," she said instead. "I didn't know what to do." Rourke studied her for a long moment. Then he reached for his hat. Wait here." He found Judge Henry Pike at the courthouse, reviewing documents in his private office. Pike was a thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and spectacles that caught lamplight when he looked up. He listened to Rourke's summary without interruption, his face betraying nothing. "The Mayhew girl," Pike said when Rourke finished. Not a question, a confirmation of social weight. "Her father serves on the town council," Rourke added, though Pike already knew. Pike removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture that bought him time to think. "This black," he said carefully. "Booker. He owns property?" 40 acres. Bought it legal 10 years ago." "Legal," Pike repeated, as if the word itself were distasteful. He replaced his spectacles. "What's your assessment, Sheriff?" Rourke understood the question beneath the question. "She's lying about something. Maybe all of it, but that won't matter." "No," Pike agreed. "It won't." They looked at each other with the understanding of men who had navigated these situations many times before. The truth was irrelevant. The accusation existed now, spreading like oil on water, and it would demand a response regardless of what had actually happened on that property line. "The girl needs to be seen by Dr. Morrison," Pike said. "For the record." "Already sent for him." "Good. Then we proceed appropriately." Pike stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced care. "I'll make the necessary calls." By sunset, 50 men had gathered at the Cypress Bend Lodge. Not all wore robes, not yet, but they would. They filled the main hall, voices low but excited, passing whiskey and rumors in equal measure. Most were merchants, farmers, men of standing who attended church on Sundays and believed fully in their right to govern the world beyond those church doors. Judge Pike addressed them from the raised platform at the hall's end, his voice calm and measured, speaking of duty and protection and the necessity of maintaining order when the law proved insufficient. He never said Zeke's name. He didn't need to. Everyone present already knew. "We cannot allow such behavior to go unanswered," Pike concluded. "Not in our town. Not against our women." The murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Outside, more men arrived. Some came from neighboring counties, summoned by telephone calls and hastily delivered messages. The Ku Klux Klan network in Mississippi was efficient, built on relationships that spanned generations. When one lodge called for assistance, others answered without question. By the time full darkness settled over Cypress Bend, torches had been lit in the yard behind the lodge. Men emerged wearing white robes and hoods, their identities obscured, but their purpose crystal clear. Horses stamped and snorted, sensing the tension in their riders. Sheriff Rourke moved through the gathering, counting heads, assessing readiness. He wore no robe himself. His authority came from the badge pinned to his chest, and that badge gave him cover the others lacked. He could be present without being present, official without being responsible. "How many?" someone asked him. Rourke looked across the assembled riders, torchlight dancing on white fabric and restless horses. 300, he said. "Maybe more." At his ranch, Ezekiel Booker worked in near darkness, moving with the same deliberate care he'd shown all day. He drove his cattle to the eastern pasture, where they'd be clear of what was coming. Then he locked the barn and checked every gate, not to keep people out, but to control how they would enter. The horses were still audible in the distance, closer now, but not yet close. Zeke walked his fence line one final time, confirming positions, testing ground that had been prepared for months. His breathing was steady. His hands did not shake. This was not panic. This was simply the final stage of work that had begun long before Lillian Mayhew invented her story. He returned to his porch and sat, listening to the night. The sound of hoofbeats had multiplied, no longer individual riders, but a mass of movement flowing toward him like floodwater. 300 horses made the earth itself vibrate. 300 torches turned the horizon orange. Zeke watched them come, his face expressionless in the darkness, his massive hands resting calm on his knees. In Cypress Bend, The last of the riders mounted their horses. Judge Pike stood on the lodge steps, watching the column form. Sheriff Rourke sat astride his own horse near the front, close enough to observe but positioned to retreat if necessary. "Ride out!" Pike called, his voice carrying across the yard. 300 Ku Klux Klan riders spurred their horses forward, torches held high, moving as one terrible organism toward the Delta Ranch, where Ezekiel Booker waited in the dark. The first riders reached Zeke's fence line at 11 o'clock, torches blazing against the night sky. They came in a wave of white robes and righteous fury, 300 strong, certain of their power and their right to use it. The lead horses hit the concealed trench before anyone saw it coming. The ground simply gave way beneath them, swallowing hooves and legs into pits dug 3 feet deep and lined with sharpened stakes. Horses screamed, high, terrible sounds that cut through the night, and riders pitched forward, some thrown clear, others dragged down by their mounts' thrashing weight. Bones snapped. Men shouted in confusion and pain. "Hold!" someone yelled from the back. "Dismount! Move on foot!" But momentum carried them forward. More horses plunged into hidden trenches. More men fell. The careful formation dissolved into chaos as riders tried to pull back while others pushed ahead, unwilling to retreat before a single colored man. 20 men died in the first 5 minutes, crushed beneath falling horses or impaled on stakes they never saw. The survivors spread out, moving more carefully now, testing ground before trusting it. They advanced in smaller groups, torches held high, rifles ready. Some found the narrow paths that seemed solid, packed earth that held their weight, and followed those trails deeper onto Zeke's property. The paths led them exactly where he wanted them to go. Sheriff Rourke stayed near the fence line, watching from horseback as men fanned out across the dark land. He'd told himself he was here to maintain order, to ensure justice rather than mob violence. But he made no move to stop what was happening, and everyone present understood what his silence meant. A group of 20 riders pushed toward the main house, following what appeared to be solid ground. They walked single file through tall grass, rifles cocked, eyes searching the darkness ahead. The fire trench ignited beneath them without warning. Zeke had dug the channel months ago, 6 inches deep and filled with oil-soaked cotton and dried brush. The flame ran along its length in seconds, a wall of fire that erupted between the riders and cut them off from retreat. Men caught directly above it, ignited immediately, their robes transforming into funeral shrouds of flame. They ran, screaming, beating at themselves while the fire consumed them. Others tried to jump the burning channel. Some made it across, some didn't. Those who fell into the flames died quickly, their screams cut short by smoke and heat. From the house's shadow, Zeke watched the fire do its work. Then he moved. A dozen riders had made it past the flames, spreading out as they advanced toward the barn. They expected to find him cowering inside, perhaps armed with a rifle but easily overwhelmed by numbers. They found him standing in open ground instead, massive and waiting, his hands empty. One rider lunged first, certain the fat man would be slow. Zeke met him chest first, absorbing the collision without stepping back. The rider bounced off his bulk like hitting a wall. Before he could recover, Zeke grabbed him by the shirt and belt, lifted him bodily off the ground with a grunt of effort that sounded almost bored, and swung him spine first into the barn's corner post. The wood cracked. The man's back broke with an audible snap. Zeke let him drop and turned toward the next one. Another Ku Klux Klan rider fired at close range, the muzzle flash lighting both their faces for an instant. The bullet grazed Zeke's shoulder, tearing fabric and flesh, but not stopping forward motion. Zeke kept coming. He wrapped both massive arms around the shooter's torso and squeezed, crushing inward with the methodical pressure of a man who'd spent decades moving heavy things. Ribs gave with sounds like green wood breaking. The rider's scream died as lungs collapsed. Zeke held him upright, using the collapsing body as cover while advancing toward the others. A third rider tried to run, dropping his torch and scrambling back toward the fence line. Zeke didn't chase. He couldn't. His weight made him slow over distance, but he could throw. He gripped the dead man he'd been carrying, pivoted with surprising speed, and hurled the corpse at the fleeing rider like a farmer tossing a feed sack. A full-grown man flew through the air and slammed into the runner's back, driving both bodies into the cattle gate with enough force to warp the iron frame. Neither moved again. The remaining riders scattered, firing wildly as they retreated. Bullets whined past Zeke's head. One caught him in the thigh, a through-and-through that made him grunt but didn't drop him. He limped toward the nearest man, caught him before he could reload, and grabbed his jaw with one enormous hand. He crushed the windpipe with his thumb, holding steady pressure until the last breath rattled out, and the body went limp. Then he moved to the next one. By midnight, the assault had fragmented completely. Small groups of Ku Klux Klan riders wandered through darkness, separated from each other by fire and terrain, and growing panic. They called out, trying to regroup, and their voices drew Zeke to them like predators drawn to wounded prey. He found a cluster of 5 men near the swamp edge, knee-deep in water they'd mistaken for solid ground. They saw his silhouette approaching and fired together, a ragged volley that kicked up dirt and water. One bullet caught him in the gut. Another creased his skull. Zeke kept walking. He reached the first man, grabbed his head with both hands, and twisted until vertebrae separated with a wet crack. Used the falling body to knock another rider into deeper water, then followed him down, holding him under with one hand while the man thrashed and drowned. The others tried to run through the swamp, but the mud held them. Zeke caught them one by one, his movements slow but inevitable, killing each with brutal efficiency born from decades of forced labor that had built terrible strength into his frame. The mud ran red in starlight. At 2 a.m, Judge Pike arrived at the fence line with 50 more riders, reinforcements summoned when reports filtered back that the assault had stalled. He found Sheriff Rourke standing beside his horse, staring into the darkness where torches had been extinguished and gunfire had gone silent. "Status?" Pike demanded. Rourke didn't answer immediately. He was listening to the quiet, trying to understand how 300 armed men could make no sound at all. "Send them in," Pike ordered. The new riders advanced cautiously, finding carnage immediately. Bodies lay everywhere, some burned, some broken, some drowned in mud or blood. The survivors from the first wave were nowhere to be found. The land itself seemed to have swallowed them. Zeke took the reinforcements the same way he'd taken the first wave, through preparation, through violence, through the simple mathematics of turning his body into a weapon that the Ku Klux Klan had never expected to encounter. By 4 o'clock, the killing had stopped, because there was no one left to kill. Sunrise came slowly, bleeding orange and red across the delta horizon. Zeke stood in the center of his property, surrounded by silence so complete it felt unnatural. Bodies lay everywhere, scattered across 40 acres like storm debris. 300 Ku Klux Klan riders, 300 horses, all dead. Zeke's clothes hung in tatters, soaked with blood, his own and others. Bullet wounds leaked steady streams down his arms and legs. His breathing came hard, not from exhaustion, but from the effort of restraint finally released. He looked across his land as morning light revealed the full scope of what had happened here, what he had made happen. The title was not metaphor. 300 men had come to kill him. None of them were going home. The sun climbed higher, revealing everything. 300 corpses scattered across 40 acres, horses lying twisted in ditches, legs broken, necks snapped. Blood everywhere, pooled in low spots, soaked into earth, dried black on fence posts and barnwood. The smell would come soon, when the heat really settled in. Zeke stood motionless for a long moment, surveying his work. Then he began the methodical process of erasure. He started with the bodies nearest the house, dragging them one by one toward the swamp's edge. His movements were slow, deliberate, conserved. Each step sent pain shooting through bullet wounds that still leaked red down his legs and torso. He ignored it. Pain was information, nothing more. And the information told him he could still move, still work, still finish what needed finishing. The first body he grabbed was heavy, dead weight that required both hands and considerable effort to move. Zeke hooked his arms under the corpse's shoulders and hauled backward, boots digging trenches in mud as he pulled. 30 yards to the water. He dumped the body at the edge, then went back for another, and another, and another. The swamp had currents most people couldn't see, channels that ran deep beneath the surface, flowing south toward bigger waterways. Zeke had studied those currents for years, learning how they moved, where they pulled strongest. He rolled bodies into specific spots, places where the water would take them and carry them away from his property. Some sank immediately, weighted down by boots and guns. Others floated briefly before the current caught them and drew them under. By noon, he'd cleared 20 bodies this way. 180 remained. He changed tactics. The fire trenches he'd dug for defense could serve another purpose. He widened the nearest one, using a shovel to deepen the channel and clear debris. Then he began dragging bodies toward it, stacking them inside like cordwood. The work took hours. Sweat mixed with blood, running down his face and chest. His breath came harder. The bullet wound in his gut throbbed with each movement, but he kept moving. When the trench held 30 bodies, he doused them with lamp oil from the barn, struck a match, stepped back as flames erupted. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming cloth and flesh with greedy efficiency. Zeke watched it work, then turned to gather more bodies while the flames did their job. He couldn't burn everything. That would create smoke visible for miles, draw attention he couldn't afford yet. But he could burn enough to reduce the physical evidence, turn recognizable men into anonymous ash. While dragging the next load toward the fire, something fell from a dead rider's pocket. Zeke paused, looked down. A small leather wallet, worn and expensive. He picked it up, flipped it open. Inside, identification papers, business cards, a photograph of a family standing in front of a courthouse. The name on the papers read, Robert Fitzgerald, State Representative, District 4. Zeke closed the wallet slowly, opened it again to make sure he'd read correctly. He had. A state representative, not just local Ku Klux Klan. Someone with real power, real connections, someone whose disappearance would trigger serious attention. He checked the next body, found similar items, letters addressed to a county commissioner, a sheriff's badge from 2 towns over, business correspondence that referenced banking and land deals worth thousands of dollars. The next one carried a judge's seal. Zeke stopped dragging bodies. He moved through the carnage systematically instead, checking pockets, examining faces he could still recognize beneath blood and damage. What he found confirmed his growing understanding. These weren't just local riders acting on racial hatred and mob impulse. This was organized, coordinated. Men of genuine power and influence had come here personally to kill him, confident their positions would protect them from consequences. He collected the identifying documents, gathering them into a canvas sack from the barn. Letters, cards, badges, photographs, anything that proved who these men had been, what power they'd wielded. Evidence that would mean something, if presented correctly, to the right people, in the right context. But presenting evidence required survival, and survival required eliminating what remained visible here. By mid-afternoon, Zeke had burned or drowned nearly 200 bodies. The remaining 100 he scattered. Some pushed deep into the swamp where alligators would find them, others buried in shallow graves around the property's perimeter, covered with brush and returned to something resembling natural ground. The work exhausted him completely. Blood loss made him dizzy. His vision blurred at the edges. He couldn't stay here. That truth had become obvious the moment he'd found the state representative's wallet. Men this important didn't disappear without massive retaliation. The next wave would be worse. Trained militia, federal marshals maybe, men with no connection to the Ku Klux Klan who'd simply be following orders to capture or kill whoever had slaughtered 300 riders. The ranch was finished. Staying meant dying, and dying meant the truth of what happened here would be written by the same power that had sent these men in the first place. Zeke walked through the house one final time, gathering what little mattered. The documents he'd collected, a few tools, dried food wrapped in canvas, ammunition for the rifle he'd never fired during the assault. He moved through rooms that had been his home for years, seeing them now as someone else's property, a place that belonged to his past rather than his future. He dismantled the most obvious evidence of preparation, covered the remaining fire trenches with dirt, smoothed ground where bodies had left deep impressions, scattered hay over bloodstains that wouldn't wash away. The work was incomplete, performative almost, because no amount of covering would hide what had happened here once authorities began serious investigation. But it might buy him hours, maybe a day, before the scope of the massacre became fully apparent. At late afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, Zeke stood on his porch one final time. He looked across land he'd shaped and worked and transformed into something that had saved his life. Looked at the barn where he'd killed men with his bare hands. Looked toward the swamp that had swallowed so many bodies. Then he turned his back on all of it, lifted the canvas sack over his shoulder, and walked away from the only home he'd known as a free man. The ranch remained behind him, silent, and waiting for whoever would come next. The telegraph operator in Coldwater received the first message at 6:30 that evening. Wife of merchant Thomas Crawford, reporting husband missing since previous night. Expected return by noon. No word since departure. The operator logged it, noting the concern but attributing no special significance. Men sometimes stayed late at business, drank too much, slept off indiscretion before facing their families. He filed the message and returned to his dinner. By 7 o'clock, 4 more messages had arrived. Then 6, then 12. By 8 o'clock, the telegraph office had received 43 separate reports of missing men, all last seen heading toward the same destination, the Booker Ranch, 15 miles outside town. The operator abandoned his dinner and ran to find Sheriff Calvin Rourke. Rourke sat in his office when the breathless operator arrived, still holding the stack of messages that had transformed a quiet evening into something else entirely. The sheriff read through them twice, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something harder, more controlled. 43 men, Rourke said quietly. All missing. More now, the operator corrected. 51 as of 5 minutes ago. And more messages still coming in. Rourke stood, reaching for his coat. Get Judge Pike. Get the mayor. Get anyone with authority and tell them to meet at the courthouse immediately. Within an hour, the courthouse conference room filled with worried officials, prominent citizens, and family members demanding answers. The initial count of missing men had climbed to 78, then 94. By 9 o'clock, when the emergency assembly officially convened, 137 men had been reported missing, all connected to the same event, the raid on Ezekiel Booker's property. Judge Henry Pike called the assembly to order, his voice strained with barely controlled alarm. We need facts. Who organized this raid? Who gave orders? No one answered immediately. The silence stretched uncomfortably until a councilman named Davies finally spoke. It was discussed at the lodge meeting 3 nights ago. After that woman's accusation, he paused. But there was no official organization. Men decided individually to ride out there. 137 men decided individually? Pike's skepticism was sharp. In perfect coordination? It's how these things work, Sheriff Rourke interjected. Word spreads. Men act. There's no formal structure. No written orders. Convenient, Pike muttered. Then louder. Has anyone actually been to the Booker property? Confirmed what happened there? Silence again. We sent 2 deputies at sunset, Rourke said. They haven't reported back yet. Then send more. Send everyone available. We need to know. Pike stopped mid-sentence as a commotion erupted at the courthouse entrance. The 2 deputies who'd been sent earlier stumbled into the assembly, both pale and shaking. The younger one vomited immediately upon entering, spattering the polished floor. The older one simply stood there, eyes unfocused, breathing too fast. Rourke crossed the room in 3 strides. Report. What did you find? The older deputy opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Bodies, he finally managed. Everywhere. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. We didn't stay long enough to count. He looked at the assembled officials with an expression that mixed horror and incomprehension. It's a slaughterhouse out there. The room erupted into chaos. Men shouting, demanding details, some calling for immediate armed response. Pike hammered his gavel repeatedly, barely restoring order. Everyone quiet, he bellowed. Deputy, continue your report. How many bodies did you actually see? Maybe 30, visible from the road. But there were signs of fire, covered ground, swamp channels that looked disturbed. Sheriff, there could be. His voice broke. There could be hundreds more. The number hung in the air, like smoke. And Booker? Rourke asked quietly. Gone. House abandoned. Looked like someone cleaned up and left. Another wave of shouting filled the room. Pike didn't bother trying to restore order this time. He leaned close to Rourke instead, speaking directly into the sheriff's ear. This goes beyond local jurisdiction. We need state resources. Military, if necessary. Rourke nodded. I'll send word to the capital immediately. And the newspapers, Pike added. They'll have this story by morning, regardless of what we do. We need to control the narrative before it controls us. The newspapers did indeed have the story by morning, though story was a generous term for what they published. The Coldwater Gazette's front page screamed in 2-inch letters, Black Monster slaughters innocent men. Below the headline, an article constructed entirely from speculation, rumor, and deliberate fabrication described Ezekiel Booker as a violent criminal who'd lured peaceful citizens to his property and murdered them using traps, poison, and savage brutality. The article made no mention of the Ku Klux Klan, the lynch mob's intent, or Lillian Mayhew's false accusation that had triggered the raid. Instead, it painted a picture of unprovoked massacre, of civilization under assault from barbaric violence. Similar articles appeared in papers across the state within 24 hours. Each version embellished the previous one, adding invented details about Booker's supposed criminal history, his alleged threats against white women, his rumored connections to northern agitators. By the second day, newspapers as far as Memphis and New Orleans were publishing stories about the Mississippi Massacre, transforming a lynch mob's failed assault into a tale of innocent victims cut down by murderous rage. The governor's office responded with appropriate outrage, issuing a formal declaration that all state resources would be dedicated to capturing the perpetrator and bringing him to justice. That declaration included the assignment of Captain Wallace Reed to lead the manhunt. Reed arrived in Coldwater 3 days after the initial discovery, accompanied by 24 state militia and authority to requisition whatever additional resources he deemed necessary. He was 42 years old, military-trained, with a reputation for methodical efficiency and successful manhunts across 3 states. He'd tracked deserters during the war, criminals afterward, and had never failed to bring in his target. He established his command center in the courthouse, spread maps across a commandeered table, and began systematic analysis of available information. The Booker property, terrain features, reported sightings, potential hiding places. He interviewed the deputies who'd discovered the massacre, examined their descriptions of the scene, noted details they probably didn't realize they'd provided. He cleaned up, Reed observed to his second-in-command. Took time to hide evidence, cover tracks, prepare for pursuit. That suggests planning, not panic. Intelligence, not animal reaction. You think he anticipated we'd come after him? I think he anticipated everything, Reed said quietly, including this conversation. 15 miles southeast, in a structure buried so deep in swamp territory that maps didn't acknowledge its existence, Zeke heard dogs in the distance. He'd traveled through the night after leaving his ranch, moving through waterways and mud channels that left minimal trail. The structure he'd reached before dawn was a trapper's shack abandoned 20 years prior, slowly being reclaimed by the swamp, but still offering shelter and concealment. He'd discovered it years ago during his initial land surveys, noted its location, and never mentioned its existence to anyone. Now it served as temporary refuge while he decided his next move. The documents he'd collected from the dead riders lay spread before him on a rotting table. Evidence of power, influence, coordination, proof that what had happened at his ranch wasn't random violence, but organized assault by men who believed their positions made them untouchable. The dogs grew louder, closer. Zeke gathered the documents carefully, wrapped them in oilcloth, and secured the package inside his coat. Then he checked his rifle, counted remaining ammunition, and moved to the shack's single window. Through gaps in the vegetation, he could see movement. Men spreading out in a search line, methodically covering ground. Professional, organized, not a mob this time, but trained hunters. He'd expected this, prepared for it, but seeing it made the situation real in a way anticipation never could. The search parties were closing in. The first mistake the militia made was assuming numbers would be enough. They surrounded the shack at mid-morning, 23 men moving in coordinated formation under Captain Reed's direct command, professional soldiers following established protocols for apprehending dangerous criminals. They announced their presence, demanded surrender, and when no response came, they breached the door. Zeke was waiting inside. The lead soldier entered first, rifle raised, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. He saw the large figure rising from behind an overturned table and processed the information according to his training. Identify target, assess threat level, prepare to fire. He never completed the sequence. Zeke crossed the room in 3 steps, impossibly fast for a man his size, and grabbed the soldier's rifle barrel. Instead of trying to wrestle it away, he simply yanked forward, pulling the soldier off balance while simultaneously driving his shoulder into the man's chest. The impact sounded like a mallet hitting meat. The soldier flew backward into 2 men behind him, all 3 collapsing in a tangle of limbs and weapons. The second soldier through the door fired. The bullet carved wood from the door frame as Zeke moved left, using the fallen men as obstacles between himself and the shooter. Another shot. Another miss. Then Zeke reached the shooter and wrapped one massive hand around the man's wrist, squeezing until fingers opened reflexively, and the rifle clattered to the floor. The soldier tried to pull free. Couldn't. Looked up into Zeke's face, and saw something that made him stop struggling entirely. "Go," Zeke said quietly, releasing him. The soldier stumbled backward through the door, nearly falling, then turned and ran. 3 more militiamen pushed through the entrance together, trying to use combined force to overwhelm the narrow space. Tactical sound reasoning that failed to account for physics. Zeke met them head-on, absorbing their forward momentum and converting it into leverage. He caught the nearest man by his uniform jacket, lifted him entirely off the ground, 200 pounds raised like a child, and threw him sideways into his companions. All 3 crashed against the shack's interior wall, hard enough to crack ancient timber. Outside, Captain Reed heard the chaos and made rapid calculations. The shack had one door, two windows. Multiple entry points meant divided force, but it also meant overwhelming firepower if coordinated properly. "Windows," he ordered. "Suppressing fire. Drive him toward the door." Rifles barked simultaneously. Glass exploded inward. Wood splintered. The interior of the shack filled with smoke and noise and flying debris. Zeke dropped flat, letting the initial volley pass overhead, then rolled behind the overturned table. Not substantial cover, but enough to break line of sight. He counted shots, listened to reload patterns, estimated positions. The firing paused. Someone shouted orders. Boots hit the porch. Zeke surged upward, table in both hands, and charged the door. 4 militiamen were entering when 200 pounds of man and 100 pounds of furniture hit them like a battering ram. The table shattered. The men went down. Zeke kept moving, trampling over fallen bodies, gaining the porch, then the yard beyond. He should have been easy to shoot. Large target. Open ground. Multiple riflemen with clear sight lines. But panic makes accuracy difficult, and the sight of a man that size moving that fast created hesitation. Just enough delay for Zeke to reach the nearest tree line before organized fire could establish proper targeting. Bullets chewed bark, tore leaves, found empty air. Zeke vanished into the swamp. Captain Reed stood in the destroyed shack, surveying casualties. 8 men injured, 3 seriously. 1 with a broken collarbone, another with shattered ribs, a third unconscious, possibly concussed. None shot, none stabbed, all hurt by blunt force and physical contact. "He was unarmed," Reed asked the least injured soldier. "Had a rifle leaning against the wall. Never touched it. Just used his hands." The soldier's voice shook slightly. "Sir, I've trained with hand-to-hand combat instructors, fought in close quarters during the war. I've never seen anyone move like that. Especially not what?" The soldier didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Reed moved through the shack methodically, examining evidence. Blood on the floor. Militia blood. Not the fugitives. Broken furniture. Disturbed dirt where heavy weight had moved quickly. He crouched, studying boot prints, noting how deep they pressed into soft ground. "Estimate his weight," Reed said to his second-in-command. "At least 300 pounds, maybe more." And he outran 23 armed men. Reed stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Send word to all search teams. Update the threat assessment. This man is not to be approached by groups smaller than a dozen. And even then, only with extreme caution." "You think he's that dangerous?" Reed looked at the bloodstains, the broken men being carried to wagons outside, the splintered furniture. "I think we've been hunting him like a criminal. We need to start hunting him like what he actually is." "Which is?" "A weapon." Reed moved toward the door, pausing to examine deep gouges in the doorframe where something heavy had struck repeatedly. "One that's been preparing for this fight longer than we've been chasing him." By early evening, the militia had reorganized at a forward position 2 miles from the shack. Medical personnel treated injuries. Officers reviewed engagement reports. Reed studied updated maps, marking locations of confirmed sightings and probable escape routes. A messenger arrived from town, carrying urgent communications from the governor's office. Reed read them twice, his expression darkening. "They're sending reinforcements," he told his assembled officers. 50 additional militia, authorization to use whatever force necessary, and a directive to make this hunt the highest priority in the state. Because of the original massacre? Because 8 more men got hurt today. Reed folded the messages carefully. The governor's exact words were "escalate until resolved." That means if standard tactics don't work, we use extraordinary tactics. If conventional force fails, we apply overwhelming force. One of the junior officers raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, what if overwhelming force isn't enough?" Reed considered the question seriously. Around them, Injured men groaned while medics worked. In the distance, search dogs bayed uselessly at swamp edges, where scent trails vanished into water. Somewhere out in that darkness, a man who should have been easy to catch remained free, despite everything thrown at him. "Then we burn the swamp," Reed said quietly. "Every acre, if necessary. We make the entire region uninhabitable until he has nowhere left to hide." He turned back to his maps, already planning the next phase. Behind him, officers exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The manhunt was escalating exactly as predicted. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Zeke heard the new dogs arriving and counted the additional voices joining the search. He'd known they would send more men. Known overwhelming force would eventually come. He'd prepared for that too. The knock came at Isaiah Cole's cabin door 2 hours past midnight. He knew what it meant before opening. White men didn't visit at that hour for conversation. They came for leverage, for information, for the kind of cooperation that couldn't be requested in daylight where other black folks might witness. Sheriff Rourke stood on the porch, flanked by 2 deputies. Behind them, barely visible in darkness, 3 more men waited near horses. "Evening, Isaiah," Rourke said pleasantly. "Mind if we come inside?" It wasn't a question. Isaiah stepped back, letting them enter his small home. His wife and 2 children slept in the next room. He saw Rourke's eyes flick toward that door, noting their presence, calculating leverage. "We need your help with something," Rourke continued, settling into Isaiah's best chair without invitation. "There's a dangerous fugitive hiding in the swamp. Man named Ezekiel Booker. You know him?" Isaiah's throat went dry. Everyone in the black community knew Zeke, though most had never met him. Knew he'd bought land when that shouldn't have been possible. Knew he kept to himself, worked hard, never caused trouble. Knew white folks had decided he needed killing anyway. "I know of him," Isaiah said carefully. "Good, because we need someone who can move through certain areas without drawing attention. Someone who knows the back paths. Someone the fugitive might trust enough to get close to." Rourke smiled without warmth. "Someone like you, Isaiah. Man who does business in town and in the quarters. Man who understands how to navigate between different worlds. I don't know where he is, but you could find him, if you wanted to." Rourke leaned forward. "And you do want to, because helping us means your family stays safe. Your job at the mill continues. Your credit at the general store remains good." He paused. "Your children keep attending that church school." The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and absolute. Isaiah felt his hands shaking and clasped them behind his back. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Just talk to people. Listen. Find out where he's hiding. Then tell us." Rourke stood, adjusting his gun belt. Simple conversation. Nobody gets hurt. "Well, nobody except the fugitive, but that's happening whether you help or not. This way, you're on the right side of things, the safe side." After they left, Isaiah sat in darkness for a long time. His wife appeared in the doorway, holding their youngest child. "What did they want?" she whispered. "Information about Zeke Booker." She went very still. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet." Isaiah rubbed his face. "But they'll be back. And next time, they won't ask politely. We could leave, take the children and—" "Go where? You think they won't follow? Think they won't send word ahead?" He looked at his wife, seeing fear in her eyes that matched what he felt. "We're caught, just like always." She held their child tighter. "What are you going to do?" Isaiah didn't answer immediately. He thought about Zeke Booker, a man he'd never met, but whose story represented something important. Independence, dignity, the possibility that black folks could own land and defend it successfully. Every person in the community felt that symbolic weight, even if they never spoke it aloud. But symbols didn't feed children, didn't protect families from men with badges and guns. "I'm going to survive," Isaiah said finally. Same as I've always done. It took Isaiah 2 days to learn what the militia needed. 2 days of careful conversations, of listening to gossip in the quarters, of tracking rumors about where Zeke might have gone to ground. He didn't have to investigate hard. People trusted him, shared freely with someone they thought was community. That trust felt like acid in his stomach. The location came from an old woman who'd seen smoke rising from an abandoned fishing shack near the deep swamp. She mentioned it casually, not realizing the significance. Isaiah nodded, thanked her, and felt something die inside himself. That night, he walked to the militia camp and asked to speak with Captain Reed. They moved before dawn, 80 men in coordinated formation, not rushing this time, not assuming easy capture. They surrounded the fishing shack in complete silence, weapons ready, every approach covered. Reed gave the signal. They crashed through simultaneously from 3 directions, overwhelming the space before resistance could organize. Zeke fought, caught 2 men with brutal efficiency, sent another sprawling. But numbers and surprise worked against him. They piled onto him, 8 men holding him down while others secured chains. Even then, it took time. Even restrained, Zeke's strength required constant pressure from multiple points. They didn't hit him, didn't need to, just maintained overwhelming physical control until exhaustion made resistance impossible. By the time they finished securing him, 15 militiamen bore fresh bruises, and one had dislocated fingers from trying to maintain grip. Reed studied the captured fugitive carefully. "No more killing today?" Zeke said nothing. "Smart. Because if you'd hurt anyone else, we'd have shot you where you lay." Reed nodded to his men. "Transport him. Double restraints. Guard rotation every hour. Nobody gets careless." They loaded Zeke into a reinforced wagon as sunrise broke across the swamp. Chains secured him to iron rings bolted through floorboards. 8 armed guards surrounded the wagon, with riders fore and aft. Isaiah watched from a distance, hidden in tree line, as the convoy prepared to move. He'd stayed to witness the result of his betrayal, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe to confirm it was real. Maybe to see what survival cost. Zeke's eyes swept across the landscape as they secured him, taking in details with that same methodical observation Isaiah had heard others describe. For one terrible moment, those eyes found Isaiah in the shadows. Recognition passed between them. Not accusation, not anger, just acknowledgement of what had been done and what it meant. Then the wagon rolled forward, carrying Zeke toward trial and execution. Isaiah remained in the trees long after the convoy disappeared, trying to decide if the shame he felt would eventually fade or if it would stay forever, a permanent weight added to all the other compromises survival demanded. The jail cell smelled of old stone and rust. Morning light filtered through a single window set too high to reach, casting thin bars of illumination across concrete floor. Zeke sat on the iron cot, bolted to the wall, chains connecting his wrists to a ring in the floor. They'd measured the length carefully. Enough to allow sitting or standing, not enough to reach the door. Sheriff Rourke entered with Deputy Marshal Harrison and 2 guards from the state prison. They stopped just outside the cell, studying their prisoner with the careful assessment of men who'd heard stories but needed to verify truth. "Stand up," Rourke ordered. Zeke remained seated. "I said stand up." "Heard you the first time." Rourke's jaw tightened. He nodded to the guards. "Get him up." They entered cautiously, approaching from both sides. The first guard grabbed Zeke's shoulder to pull him upright. Zeke moved faster than his size suggested possible. Twisted, drove his shoulder into the guard's stomach, used momentum and weight to slam the man against the cell wall hard enough to crack plaster. The second guard swung his club. Zeke caught the blow on his forearm, grabbed the weapon, yanked the guard off balance. The chain arrested his follow-through, preventing full extension, but he still managed to drive his knee into the guard's ribs before they could retreat. Both guards scrambled backward, breathing hard. "Jesus Christ," one muttered, rubbing his side. Rourke studied Zeke with new understanding. You done proving your point? Wasn't proving anything. You wanted me standing. I disagreed. Zeke settled back onto the cot. Try again if you need to. Harrison stepped forward, hand on his revolver. We could just shoot you here. Save everyone the trouble of a trial. Could, Zeke agreed. But you won't. Because then you don't get to make an example. Don't get to show other folks what happens when they step out of line. He looked at each man in turn. You need me alive long enough for the performance. The accuracy of that assessment hung in the air. Undeniable. Rourke dismissed the injured guards and sent for replacements. You think you're clever? Think because you killed a bunch of night riders, you've accomplished something. Killed 300 men who came to murder me on my own land, Zeke corrected. Wasn't trying to accomplish anything except staying alive. Self-defense? Harrison laughed without humor. That's your story? That's what happened. What happened, Rourke said coldly, is you slaughtered 300 white men through premeditation and ambush. That's mass murder. And you're going to hang for it. Zeke said nothing. The new guards arrived, 4 this time, all carrying clubs and moving with the rigid wariness of men who'd been warned. They didn't enter the cell, just took positions outside, watching. We're going to make you presentable for court, Rourke continued. Clean you up, put you in proper clothes, show the judge and jury a peaceful prisoner who understands his situation. He paused. Or we can do this the hard way. Your choice. Hard way, then. Rourke's expression didn't change. You sure about that? I'm sure I'm not making anything easy for you. Not standing when told. Not speaking when ordered. Not playing the role you want. Zeke leaned back against cold stone. You've got me in chains. Got me locked up. But you don't got me cooperating. And you won't. Harrison drew his revolver, cocking the hammer. Maybe I'll just put that away. Judge Henry Pike's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the corridor, dressed in formal court attire despite the early hour. I'll have order in these proceedings, even before trial begins. Harrison holstered his weapon reluctantly. Pike approached the cell, studying Zeke with the detached interest of a scientist examining an unusual specimen. Ezekiel Booker. I've reviewed the initial reports. Quite extraordinary, really. 300 men dead in one night. Even accounting for traps and terrain advantage, the physical reality of that accomplishment is remarkable. Didn't feel remarkable, Zeke said. Felt necessary. Necessary. Pike savored the word. An interesting defense strategy. Unfortunately, necessity doesn't justify murder under Mississippi law. Especially not on this scale. Wasn't murder. Was survival. The distinction will be determined by a jury of your peers. Pike smiled faintly at the obvious impossibility of that phrase. Or rather, a jury of white landowners who lost friends and relatives to your actions. I'm sure they'll be quite objective. Don't expect objectivity from a system built on violence. Then what do you expect? Pike asked with genuine curiosity. Zeke met his gaze directly. Nothing. I expect nothing from you people except what you've always given. Pain, chains, death. But I made you pay for it first. Made you spend 300 lives trying to take mine. That's what I expect you to remember. Pike's expression hardened. We'll remember. The entire state will remember. That's precisely why this trial will proceed with full legal formality. Not a lynching. Not mob justice. A proper court proceeding that demonstrates our legal system works exactly as designed, even when tested by extraordinary circumstances. He turned to Rourke. Keep him secured. No physical discipline unless absolutely necessary. I want him able to stand trial without visible injuries that might complicate prosecution. Pike glanced back at Zeke. We'll begin preliminary proceedings tonight. I've called in additional judges and prosecutors from neighboring counties. This trial will be comprehensive, thorough, and entirely legal. The verdict is predetermined, but the process matters. After they left, Zeke remained on the cot, listening to footsteps fade down the corridor. His body ached from the brief struggle, bruises already forming where the guard's club had connected. But pain was familiar, expected. The cell door opened once more near midday. A guard pushed in a tray of food, cornbread and water, barely enough to sustain. Zeke ate slowly, methodically, maintaining strength regardless of what came next. Through the high window, he could hear the town stirring, voices carrying news of the upcoming trial, excitement building for the spectacle. People traveling from surrounding counties, eager to witness justice performed on the man who'd killed so many. By evening, the jail filled with additional guards. They stationed men at every entrance, on the roof, in the corridor outside Zeke's cell, taking no chances, preparing for the legal proceedings Judge Pike had promised. Zeke heard them assembling in the courthouse next door. Lawyers, officials, journalists documenting everything for posterity. The machinery of law grinding forward with deliberate precision, building toward a conclusion everyone already knew. He stood finally, testing the chain's length, confirming their limitations. His body remained strong despite imprisonment, despite the weight of chains and the certainty of what approached. The guards outside tensed when he moved, hands moving toward weapons, expecting violence. But Zeke simply stood, facing the window where evening light faded into darkness, and waited for the performance to begin. The morning papers arrived before dawn, distributed through channels the authorities hadn't monitored. Black churches across 3 counties received identical packages during overnight delivery. Thick manila envelopes sealed with wax, addressed simply to the faithful. Pastor William Cross opened his envelope in the dim light of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Clarksdale. Inside, photographs, documents, receipts, a ledger detailing prison labor contracts signed by Judge Pike. Letters from Sheriff Rourke coordinating Ku Klux Klan activities with county officials. Bank records showing payments from the state to private landowners for convict leasing. And a single typed note: "The truth survives me. Make copies. Distribute widely. Let them explain." Pastor Cross stared at the materials spread across his desk, understanding immediately what he held. Evidence. Comprehensive, damning, undeniable evidence of the system Zeke had fought against. Not just accusations, proof. "Deacon Matthews," he called. "Wake everyone. We need to move these before sunrise." Similar scenes unfolded simultaneously in Jackson, Greenwood, Vicksburg. Pastors and deacons working by candlelight, photographing documents, making handwritten copies, preparing distribution networks that had operated in shadow for generations. By the time authorities realized what was happening, the information had already spread too far to contain. At the county courthouse, Judge Pike received word during breakfast. Captain Reed handed him a copy of the documents, retrieved from a church raid in Greenwood. "Where did these come from?" Pike demanded. "Booker must have arranged distribution before his capture," Reed said. "We're finding them in churches across the Delta, all identical packages, all containing— I can see what they contain." Pike's hands trembled slightly as he read his own signatures on prison labor contracts, saw calculations showing profit margins from convict leasing, recognized correspondence he'd thought safely destroyed. "How many have been distributed?" "We've confiscated maybe 30 packages, but witnesses report seeing dozens more, maybe hundreds." Reed paused. "They're making copies, spreading them through their communities faster than we can intercept." Pike stood abruptly, walking to the window overlooking the town square where crowds had already gathered for the trial. White faces, expectant and hungry for justice. But now, underneath that surface, other conversations were happening. Whispers that would grow louder. "It doesn't matter," Pike said finally. "These documents don't change the legal reality. Booker killed 300 men. That's mass murder regardless of any alleged systemic injustice. We proceed as planned. The newspapers, the white newspapers, will report what we tell them to report. The black newspapers don't reach our voting population. And even if every person in Mississippi saw these documents, it wouldn't change the fundamental truth. A black man committed mass murder against white citizens. The law is clear. The verdict is certain. Reed shifted uncomfortably. There's already talk. People asking questions about the contracts, about where the money goes. Let them talk. By tonight, Ezekiel Booker will be sentenced to hang, and that conversation will be drowned out by celebration. Pike returned to his desk, gathering trial documents. The execution proceeds at dawn tomorrow. That's what people will remember, not some papers distributed to churches nobody cares about. The trial began at 10 o'clock in a courthouse packed beyond capacity. Spectators filled every seat, lined the walls, crowded the hallways outside. Judge Pike presided from an elevated bench, flanked by 2 additional judges brought in to lend weight to the proceedings. Zeke sat in chains at the defendant's table, no lawyer beside him. He'd refused counsel, refused to participate in what he called theater. He sat silent as prosecutors detailed his crimes, as witnesses described the carnage at his ranch, as evidence was presented documenting 300 deaths. The prosecution took 4 hours to present their case. They called Sheriff Rourke, who testified about finding bodies and evidence of systematic trapping. They called Captain Reed, who described Zeke's capture and the militia casualties incurred during pursuit. They called Lillian Mayhew, who wept convincingly while repeating her false accusation. Zeke watched it all without expression. When offered the chance to speak in his own defense, he stood slowly, chains rattling. "I got nothing to say to this court," he stated clearly. "You already decided what happens here. This ain't about truth or justice. This is about making sure nobody else tries what I did." He looked directly at Judge Pike. "But those papers that got distributed this morning, that's my real testimony. That's the truth about what you people built, what you profit from, what you'll kill to protect." "Sit down," Pike ordered. "You can sentence me. You can hang me. You can erase me from every record." Zeke remained standing. "But you can't erase what I did. Can't pretend 300 men didn't die trying to murder one black man on his own land. That happened. That's real. And everyone knows it now." "I said sit down." Guards moved forward, forcing Zeke back into his chair. The chains held him firmly in place. Pike called for order, his gavel striking wood with sharp cracks that echoed through the crowded courtroom. When silence finally returned, he addressed the jury. 12 white landowners who'd deliberated for exactly 7 minutes before returning. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood, a plantation owner from Coahoma County whose brother had died at Zeke's ranch. "We find the defendant, Ezekiel Booker, guilty of murder in the first degree. 300 counts." The courtroom erupted in applause and celebration. Pike allowed it to continue for a full minute before calling for order again. "Ezekiel Booker, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 300 counts of premeditated murder. The sentence for this crime is death by hanging." Pike's voice carried over the crowd. "You will be executed at dawn tomorrow in the public square. May God have mercy on your soul." Zeke said nothing as guards lifted him from the chair, began leading him from the courtroom. The crowd pressed close, shouting curses and promises of what awaited him. He walked through them steadily, eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge their presence. Back in his cell, Zeke sat on the cot and waited for darkness to fall. Outside, the town celebrated with bonfires and whiskey, preparing for the morning's spectacle. Inside, Zeke remained still, listening to time pass in increments measured by breathing. Dawn came quietly. No fanfare, just pale light filtering through the high window. Guards entered his cell at first light. They removed the floor chains and led him into the corridor where a priest waited. Offering last rites, Zeke declined. "You should make peace," the priest urged. "Already made the only peace I needed. They walked him through the jail toward the rear entrance that opened onto the public square. Through the walls, Zeke could hear the crowd gathering, hundreds of voices creating a low rumble of anticipation. The gallows had been constructed overnight. Fresh lumber, 13 steps, a trap door tested repeatedly to ensure smooth operation. Sheriff Rourke met him at the door. "Any last words you want recorded?" Zeke looked past him to where dawnlight touched the gallows platform. "Nothing you'd print truthfully." They led him forward into morning air and the roar of the assembled crowd. The rope snapped taut at 6:47 a.m. Zeke's body dropped through the trap door, jerked once, and went still. The crowd erupted in cheers that carried across the Delta morning like thunder. Judge Pike watched from the courthouse steps, satisfied. Sheriff Rourke stood beside him, nodding to the executioner. Captain Reed remained in the background, arms crossed, face unreadable. The body hung for an hour as required by law. Then guards cut it down and loaded it onto a wagon for unmarked burial in the prison cemetery. No headstone, no record, just another body in hard Mississippi soil. The crowd dispersed slowly, celebrating their victory. Justice served. Order restored. The natural hierarchy of things maintained through proper legal channels. By noon, the first newspaper arrived from Jackson. The white papers reported exactly what Pike expected. Murderer executed after fair trial. Justice prevails in Delta massacre case. State restores order following deadly rampage. But underneath those headlines, in smaller print, appeared something unexpected. Questions, raised by the documents Zeke had distributed. State officials named in prison labor contracts. Convict leasing system under scrutiny. Questions surround funding sources for county programs. Pike dismissed them immediately. Background noise. Nobody would care about administrative details when measured against mass murder. He was wrong. The black newspapers printed the full document. The Chicago Defender ran a 6-page spread detailing the convict leasing system, reproducing Pike's signatures, Sheriff Rourke's correspondence, and financial records, showing how state officials profited from black imprisonment. The NAACP distributed copies nationwide. Churches made the documents available at Sunday services. Within a week, federal investigators arrived in Mississippi. Pike received them cordially, certain he could manage the situation. But the investigators brought their own documentation, evidence gathered independently, corroborated by Zeke's materials, expanded through testimony from former prisoners and families of the deceased. The investigation took 4 months. Judge Pike was removed from the bench in October. Sheriff Rourke resigned under pressure in November. Captain Reed testified against both men in exchange for immunity, providing detailed accounts of how the prison labor system operated, how convict leasing generated revenue, how local officials coordinated with the Ku Klux Klan to maintain control. 17 county officials faced federal charges. 8 were convicted. The convict leasing system in 3 Delta counties was formally dissolved by court order. Zeke's ranch land, seized by the state after his execution, became the focus of a federal review. The seizure was ruled illegal. The property was redistributed to a black farming cooperative that Pike's family had once forced into debt peonage. The changes happened slowly, incrementally. Not revolution, but adjustment. Cracks appearing in structures previously thought permanent. Years passed. The gallows where Zeke died was dismantled. The courthouse where he was tried underwent renovation. New officials took office, some of them genuinely committed to reform, others simply better at hiding the same old practices. But the story didn't die. In 1951, 15 years after the execution, the story of Ezekiel Booker was still being told in black communities across the Delta. Not as legend, not as myth, as history. An old man named Thomas Booker, Zeke's cousin, one of the few family members who'd survived the violence that followed, sat on the porch of a modest house in Clarksdale as dusk settled over the Mississippi landscape. 3 younger people sat with him: his granddaughter, visiting from Chicago, a student from Tougaloo College researching Delta history, and a teenage boy from the neighborhood who'd heard fragments of the story and wanted to know more. "Tell it true," the granddaughter said, "the way you remember it." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out at where light faded from the sky. He was 73 years old, gray-haired and thin, wearing suspenders and work boots still dusty from the fields. "Zeke wasn't no hero," he began slowly. "Wasn't trying to be. He was a man pushed past the place where most men break, and he decided to push back in the only way available to him. They say he killed 300 Ku Klux Klan riders," the student said, pen poised over a notebook. "That's what happened. 300 men rode out to kill him for something he didn't do. 300 men died on his land. That ain't a story. That's documented fact." Courts confirmed the body count during the trial. The teenage boy leaned forward. How'd one man do that? Preparation. Years of it. He knew they'd come eventually. The system was designed so they always came. So he prepared his land, made it into something that worked with him instead of against him. Thomas paused. But it wasn't just traps. Zeke fought them directly, killed men with his bare hands when they got close, used his body, the body everyone thought was weak because he was heavy, and turned it into a weapon. "They hung him for it," the granddaughter said quietly. "They did. Gave him a trial where the verdict was decided before he walked in. Executed him at dawn, with the whole town watching." Thomas's voice remained steady. But before he died, he made sure the truth got out. All those documents proving how the system worked, who profited, how it was all connected. He distributed them, knowing he wouldn't live to see what they caused. That was his authorship. Not just killing the men who came for him, but exposing the structure that sent them. "Did it change things?" the student asked. "Some things. Not everything. Not nearly enough." Thomas looked at the darkening sky. The convict leasing system got reformed, but it didn't disappear. It just evolved, found new shapes, new ways to do the same work. Then what was the point? "The point," Thomas said carefully, "is that Zeke proved something. He proved that the system ain't invincible, that one man, properly prepared, with nothing left to lose, can damage it in ways that matter, can force it to acknowledge what it does, can make it bleed." Full darkness had settled now. Crickets sang in the warm evening air. "Is that why you're telling us this?" the granddaughter asked. "So we know it's possible?" "I'm telling you so you understand the cost. 300 men died. Zeke died. Dozens of black folks died in the retaliation that followed. The price was incredible." Thomas met each of their eyes in turn. But the alternative, accepting the system, living under it forever, that has a cost, too. A different kind. The kind that kills you slowly over generations instead of all at once. "What should we do with this story?" the student asked. "Remember it accurately. Not as inspiration. Not as romance. As warning and possibility both." Thomas stood slowly, joints creaking. Zeke didn't want to be remembered as a martyr. He wanted the system exposed, wanted people to see how it worked so they could dismantle it properly. That work ain't finished. Maybe it never will be. But now, you know it can be fought. They sat together as night completed its arrival, the story settling into them like sediment, becoming part of the delta of memory that flowed forward through time. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.